The airport buzzed with activity as travelers hurried through the terminal, dragging suitcases and clutching coffee cups, each person lost in their own world. It was a typical busy morning at JFK International Airport. People were rushing, some making last-minute phone calls, others fumbling with their boarding passes. The holiday season was in full swing, and every seat on every flight was booked solid. There was a certain charged energy in the air, a mixture of anticipation and stress that comes with the hustle of travel. Sergeant Jasmine Davis navigated through the crowded terminal with a quiet confidence that only someone used to dealing with high-pressure situations could have. Dressed in her crisp military uniform, she moved with purpose, her boots clicking against the polished floor. She was returning home after a long, exhausting deployment overseas. The desert heat, the grueling days, and the constant sense of vigilance were now behind her, at least for a little while. Her friends had surprised her by pooling together to buy her a first-class ticket. They wanted her to enjoy some comfort, a rare luxury for a soldier who had spent months sleeping on cots and enduring harsh conditions. It was their way of saying thank you for her service, a gesture of appreciation she had initially resisted but was now grateful for. As she approached the gate, she could see the line of passengers already boarding. Jasmine handed her ticket to the gate agent, who smiled warmly. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the agent said, glancing at her uniform. Jasmine nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied. The words felt automatic, a reflex response she had given so many times before. Still, there was a small comfort in the acknowledgement, a reminder that some people understood, even if only a little, what it meant to serve. Boarding the plane, Jasmine felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was almost over. Soon she would be home, surrounded by friends and family, away from the endless noise and chaos of combat. She glanced at her ticket one last time to confirm her seat. 4A, a window seat in the first-class cabin. She smiled to herself, thinking about how her friends would laugh if they knew how out of place she felt, sitting in such a plush section of the plane. This wasn't her usual environment. She was more accustomed to cargo planes cramped with supplies and personnel, not the quiet luxury of first class. Jasmine walked down the aisle, passing the rows of economy passengers who were already settling in. As she entered the first-class section, she noticed the difference immediately. The wider seats, the extra legroom, the attentive flight attendants offering pre-flight drinks to the passengers. It was a world apart from what she was used to. She moved toward her seat, but her steps slowed as she realized there was already someone sitting there. A middle-aged man in a dark, well-tailored suit was comfortably sprawled in seat 4M. He was engrossed in his tablet, tapping and scrolling, oblivious to the other passengers around him. He looked like a businessman, the kind who probably spent more time in airports than at home. Jasmine hesitated for a moment, wondering if she had read her ticket wrong, but she quickly double-checked. No, this was definitely her seat. She took a deep breath and approached him, maintaining her composure. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely, her voice steady. "I believe you're in my seat." The man looked up, his face registering a flicker of surprise before quickly shifting to irritation. He glanced her up and down, taking in her uniform with a look that bordered on disdain. It wasn't just surprise, there was something else in his eyes. Judgment. He glanced at the seat number, then back at Jasmine, as if she had made some kind of mistake. "This is first class," he said slowly, enunciating the words as though she might not understand. His tone was patronizing, and he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "You must be in the wrong section." Jasmine kept her calm, though she could feel a twinge of irritation creeping up. She wasn't in the mood for this, not after the months she had just spent overseas, witnessing things no one should ever have to see. She had earned this moment of comfort, and she wasn't going to let it be tainted by ignorance. "No, I'm not," she said, showing him her ticket. "This is my seat, 4A." The man glanced at the ticket, then back at her with a raised eyebrow, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Are you sure that's your ticket?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Maybe you should check again. This section isn't exactly public transportation." Jasmine felt the sting of his words, but she forced a smile, keeping her voice level. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "This is my seat, For a moment, he just stared at her, clearly debating whether to argue further. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to back him up, but the other passengers were busy with their own things, ignoring the unfolding confrontation. Reluctantly, he uncrossed his arms and let out an exaggerated sigh. "Fine," he muttered under his breath, standing up with a huff. He grabbed his tablet and moved a few seats down, muttering something about entitled people as he did. Jasmine slid into her seat, feeling a mixture of relief and irritation. She wasn't easily rattled, but there was something particularly grating about the encounter. It wasn't the first time she had experienced this kind of reaction, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. It didn't matter that she was a soldier, that she had risked her life for people like him. To some, all they saw was her skin color, and they made their judgments based on that alone. Settling into her seat, she took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to let it go. She knew better than to dwell on it, but it wasn't easy. The fight or flight instincts she had honed over years of service made it hard to ignore slights like this, even if they were small in the grand scheme of things. The flight attendants began their pre-flight routine, and Jasmine could feel their eyes flickering between her and the man who had refused to move. They had seen the whole thing, and she could sense their sympathy, even if they didn't say anything outright. One of them, a young woman with a kind face, leaned down slightly as she passed by Jasmine's seat. "Would you like a drink before we take off?" she asked, her voice gentle, almost conspiratorial. Jasmine gave her a grateful smile. "Just water, thank you," she replied. And the man down the row rolled his eyes when he saw the interaction. He made a loud, impatient noise, almost a grunt. "Can I get another scotch?" he called out brusquely, his eyes narrowing at Jasmine, as if she were somehow the cause of his irritation. "Make it a double." The flight attendant nodded, but there was a stiffness in her smile now, a forced politeness. Jasmine noticed and felt a pang of empathy for the woman. She knew what it was like to deal with difficult people, to have to keep a smile plastered on your face no matter how you were treated. Jasmine pulled out her phone and started scrolling through the photos stored on it. Images of her comrades, snapshots of moments from the deployment, filled the screen. Some were lighthearted, smiling faces covered in dust, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Others were somber, like the photos she took during the memorial service for a fellow soldier who had died in action. Her thumb lingered over that picture for a moment. The memory was still raw, the grief still fresh. She thought about how much he had sacrificed, how he had given his life without hesitation, and she felt a wave of sadness mixed with pride. It was then that she decided she would write a note, not because she wanted to teach the man a lesson, but because she felt compelled to say something, to remind him that the world wasn't as small and narrow as he seemed to believe. She pulled out a pen and a piece of paper from her bag, leaning against the tray table as she began to write, her pen moving swiftly, each word chosen carefully. She didn't know if the man would read it or if he would even care, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, it might plant a seed of change in his mind. Even the smallest seed can grow, she thought, as she finished the last sentence and folded the note neatly, slipping it into her pocket, ready to give it to him when the time was right. The flight progressed smoothly as the plane ascended above the clouds, leaving the busy city far below. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, finally allowing herself a moment of relaxation. The hum of the engines was oddly soothing, a familiar sound that she had come to associate with fleeting moments of calm. She glanced out the window, watching the sun's rays bounce off the tops of the clouds, turning them into a sea of brilliant white. It was beautiful up here, peaceful, a stark contrast to the world she had left behind just weeks ago. Across the aisle, the businessman continued to huff and puff, making his displeasure evident to anyone within earshot. He flagged down the flight attendant once more, demanding yet another drink. His tone was clipped and impatient, as though he believed he was the only passenger deserving of attention. Jasmine couldn't help but notice how he barely acknowledged the flight attendants, never saying please or thank you, treating them more like inconveniences than people. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes to her. She had seen this type of person many times before, entitled, dismissive, unaware of his own privilege. Jasmine turned her focus back to her phone, pulling up more pictures. As she scrolled through the familiar faces, memories came flooding back. Her unit had become her family. They had laughed together, cried together, faced unimaginable dangers together. Some of those faces would never come home again. Her fingers hovered over the image of Sergeant Tom Sullivan, a man who had been more than a comrade. He had been a mentor, a friend. He had been the one who made sure the younger soldiers were looked after, who cracked jokes during the toughest days to keep morale up. And she remembered the last mission they had gone on together, the way he had been the first to volunteer for the most dangerous part of the assignment. It was supposed to be routine, a straightforward task in a hostile area. But things had gone wrong, terribly wrong. There had been an ambush, gunfire erupting from all sides. Jasmine could still hear the echo of the shots, the shouts, the chaos of that moment. She could still see Tom diving in front of her, shielding her from a barrage of bullets. He hadn't hesitated for even a second. He had saved her life, sacrificing his own in the process. The memory hit her like a wave, crashing over her, leaving her breathless. She took a deep breath, pushing back the tears that threatened to spill over. Tom had always been a hero in her eyes, and now, every day she lived was a gift he had given her, a gift she couldn't repay but could honor by living fully and doing her best to carry forward his legacy of selflessness and courage. That first-class ticket had been meant for Tom. When her friends found out she was flying back home, they had bought it for her in his honor, knowing how much it would mean to her. It was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a way to remember him, to make sure that his sacrifice wasn't forgotten. Sitting here in this comfortable seat, surrounded by luxury, Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of that empty seat beside her, the seat where Tom should have been sitting. The businessman's voice cut through her thoughts. He was speaking loudly on the phone now, using the in-flight Wi-Fi, discussing some kind of deal or negotiation. His voice was sharp, irritated. "I don't care what it takes, just get it done," he snapped. "I'm paying you to solve these problems, not create new ones." Jasmine could see the flight attendants glancing at him, their expressions strained. It was clear they were uncomfortable, but they continued to do their jobs with the kind of professionalism she deeply respected. As a soldier, she knew what it meant to serve others, to put on a brave face even when you were exhausted or overwhelmed. It took strength to do that, and she found herself feeling grateful for their quiet resilience. Jasmine decided it was time. She carefully unfolded the note she had written earlier, reading over the words once more to make sure they conveyed what she wanted to say. It wasn't a long letter, but it was heartfelt. She had chosen her words with care, hoping they would resonate. She could have ignored the man's behavior, brushed it off as just another example of ignorance she encountered all too often. But she didn't want to let this moment pass without at least trying to make a difference, no matter how small. She rose from her seat, slipping the note into her pocket, and made her way to the restroom. The aisle was narrow and she had to carefully maneuver around the carts as the flight attendants served the last round of drinks before preparing for descent. On her way back, she noticed the businessman still seated, now staring blankly out the window, lost in his thoughts. His expression had softened slightly, the sharp lines of irritation smoothed out into something closer to fatigue. For a brief moment, she wondered what his life was like, whether he was always this way, or if something had happened to make him so bitter and impatient. Taking a deep breath, she walked up to him. "Sir," she said quietly. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected her to address him. His eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion clouding his features. "I just wanted to give you this," Jasmine said, holding out the folded note. Now, he stared at it for a moment, as though it were something foreign, something he couldn't quite understand. He didn't take it right away, just looked at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What is this?" he asked curtly. "It's just a note," she replied softly. "Something I thought you might want to read." Reluctantly, he reached out and took the piece of paper from her hand. He didn't open it, just held it loosely between his fingers, almost as if he were deciding whether it was worth his time. Jasmine gave him a small nod, not waiting for a response. She turned and walked back to her seat, feeling a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had said her piece. The rest was up to him. The businessman turned the note over in his hand, eyeing it with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. He looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching him. No one was paying attention. He hesitated, then unfolded it slowly. His eyes scanned the words, and as he read, the expression on his face changed. The irritation melted away, replaced by something else. Something like disbelief, then shock, and finally a deep, unmistakable shame. His grip on the note tightened. He looked back over at Jasmine, but she was gazing out the window now, her profile calm and serene. He read the note again, as if he couldn't quite believe what it said. To the man who doubted my right to sit in this seat, this ticket was purchased in honor of a soldier who never made it home. He gave his life protecting mine. He didn't care about my skin color, and I didn't care about his. In battle, we only see the person standing beside us. I hope that someday you can see people the same way. Respect isn't about where you sit on a plane. It's about recognizing the sacrifices others make, often without recognition or thanks. The final line struck him like a blow. The ticket was his gift to me, and today I'm sharing it with you in the hope that you might learn to see beyond the surface. He read the words over and over, his mind racing. For the first time in a long while, he was at a loss for what to say, what to think. The bravado and arrogance that had been so present just moments ago seemed to drain out of him. He looked down the aisle at the woman in the uniform, the one he had dismissed so easily, and felt a rush of embarrassment, followed quickly by regret. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that he had been wrong, not just today, but in the way he saw the world, the way he judged people without knowing their stories. He crumpled the note in his fist, then smoothed it out again, carefully folding it back into a neat square. He tucked it into his breast pocket, close to his heart, and leaned back in his seat, staring at the ceiling of the plane. It wasn't the words on the paper that shocked him the most. It was the realization of his own smallness, his own narrow view of the world. He had been given a gift far more valuable than the first-class seat he was sitting in. It was a chance to change, to be better, and he knew deep down that he needed to take it. As the flight approached its final descent into Los Angeles, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the passengers to prepare for landing. The bustling activity from earlier in the journey had settled into a quiet lull, the kind that happens when the excitement of departure fades and the anticipation of arrival takes over. The clouds outside had thickened, casting a soft gray shadow over the city below. Jasmine watched the landscape slowly materialize as they dropped altitude, the sprawling streets and highways of Los Angeles coming into view, like a vast, intricate map spreading out beneath the plane. In her seat, Jasmine took a deep breath and let it out slowly. This flight had been a microcosm of so many experiences she had faced throughout her life. A moment of quiet relaxation interrupted by judgment, a need to defend her right to be where she was, and finally a decision to respond with kindness rather than confrontation. It wasn't easy, and every time it happened, she felt the old wounds reopen, the same ache in her chest that never seemed to fully go away. But she knew that carrying herself with dignity was the only way she could honor the sacrifices of her comrades, the ones who had fought alongside her and those who never made it back. Across the aisle, the businessman was uncharacteristically silent now. His body was slumped slightly, and he stared straight ahead, lost in his own thoughts. He hadn't touched his tablet or called for another drink since reading the note. Instead, he clutched the folded paper in his hand, turning it over and over as though it held some secret he had yet to uncover. His earlier arrogance and irritation had drained away, replaced by a deep, unsettled look on his face. He couldn't seem to look in Jasmine's direction. It was as if meeting her eyes would be too much, as if the weight of her words was still sinking in, pulling him under. He had never expected to feel this way. When he first boarded the plane, he had been in a rush, consumed by the pressures of his job, irritated by delays and inconveniences. He was used to being in control, used to having his way, and it never crossed his mind that someone like Jasmine could challenge that. He had judged her the moment he saw her, making assumptions based on her uniform and the color of her skin, without ever considering the person behind those things. And now, in the wake of her note, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. The note had pierced through the layers of his defenses, the barriers he had built up over years of living a life of privilege and entitlement. It had forced him to confront something he wasn't ready to face: the fact that he had been wrong, that his view of the world was narrow and limited. He had never thought about the sacrifices soldiers made, had never considered what it might be like for someone like Jasmine to come home after serving her country, only to be treated as less than. He had been so wrapped up in his own life, his own problems, that he had forgotten there were people out there fighting battles far more significant than the ones he faced in the boardroom. He glanced around the cabin, seeing the other passengers in a new light. He realized that he had made a habit of judging people like this, of assuming he knew their stories without ever taking the time to learn them. The woman across the aisle who had been knitting throughout the flight, the young man with a backpack and headphones sitting a few rows back, the elderly couple holding hands, all of them had lives and stories he knew nothing about. He had been so quick to write people off, to categorize them into neat boxes based on superficial details. And now, for the first time, he felt the sting of his own ignorance. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, jolting slightly. The businessman instinctively gripped the armrest, his knuckles turning white. He realized that his hands were shaking. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but the note in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. He pulled it out again, smoothing the creases with his fingers. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life lost, a life sacrificed in a way he couldn't begin to understand. Jasmine, meanwhile, had closed her eyes, leaning back in her seat as the plane descended. She was trying to hold on to the small piece of peace she had managed to find. She knew she had done the right thing by giving the note, but it didn't take away the sting of the man's earlier comments. She thought about all the times she had faced this kind of prejudice. The subtle looks, the whispered remarks, the blatant dismissals. It was exhausting carrying that burden, especially after everything she had already been through. But she reminded herself that she wasn't alone. She carried with her the memory of her comrades, the voices of those who had stood by her side, no matter what. As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway with a soft thud, the cabin filled with the sound of seatbelts clicking open and passengers shuffling in their seats, gathering their belongings. Jasmine didn't rush. She had learned long ago that there was no point in hurrying off the plane. She preferred to let the crowds pass, to take her time and avoid the jostling rush. She reached down, picking up her small duffel bag from under the seat, and stood up slowly. The businessman was still seated, staring at the note in his hand. He looked up as Jasmine walked past him, his eyes searching her face as though he were trying to find the right words. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. He cleared his throat, trying again. "Ma'am," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. It was the first time he had addressed her with respect. Jasmine paused, turning to meet his gaze. There was something different in his expression now, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the irritation or superiority he had shown earlier. It was vulnerability, mixed with an apology he couldn't quite put into words. He faltered, glancing down at the note. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to look her in the eye. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't realize." Jasmine nodded slowly, her face softening. "Most people don't," she replied simply. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of the hurt she had felt earlier. Just a quiet, calm acceptance, like the still water after a storm. The businessman swallowed hard, nodding. He wanted to say more, to apologize properly, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He wasn't used to admitting when he was wrong, wasn't used to feeling this kind of raw, unfiltered regret. But he knew he needed to say something, even if it was small. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice almost a whisper. "For everything." Jasmine gave him a small, sad smile. It was a smile that held years of experience, of understanding the complexities of human nature, the good and the bad. "You're welcome," she said. Then she turned and continued down the aisle, making her way to the exit. The businessman watched her go, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. He tucked the note back into his pocket, pressing it close to his heart, as though he were trying to hold on to the lesson it carried. For the first time in years, he felt a tear well up in his eye. He quickly wiped it away, hoping no one saw. He realized that it wasn't just a note she had given him. It was a glimpse into a world he had never understood, a world of sacrifice and brotherhood, of seeing beyond the surface. As he stood up to leave the plane, He felt different, lighter but also heavier, as though the weight of his ignorance had been replaced by a new, more profound understanding. He knew he would never be able to look at a soldier the same way again. He would carry that note with him, not just in his pocket, but in his heart, as a reminder of the lesson he had learned. He stepped off the plane, feeling the rush of cool air hit his face. He took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was seeing it clearly. The businessman walked through the busy terminal of LAX, still feeling the aftershocks of the moment he had experienced on the plane. The usual chaos of the airport, the loud voices, the announcements blaring over the intercom, and the hurried footsteps of travelers all seemed muted to him. It was as if he were in a bubble, separate from the rush of the crowd. He couldn't stop thinking about the note tucked into his jacket pocket, the folded piece of paper that now felt heavier than any of his luggage. He had read it over and over again, but the words continued to echo in his mind, a constant reminder of his own ignorance and the stark reality he had never considered. He moved slowly, almost aimlessly, towards the baggage claim area. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a rush. He usually hated this part of traveling, the crowded, chaotic scene of people jostling for their bags, the relentless noise, the anxiety of making it to his next appointment on time. Today, however, he found himself standing still, watching the people around him with new eyes. He noticed things he had never noticed before. A mother struggling with two small children in a stroller, an elderly couple moving slowly, their faces etched with the deep lines of a long life lived together. A young man in a hoodie leaning against the wall, looking lost and exhausted. The businessman felt a pang of guilt as he realized how often he had overlooked these moments, too wrapped up in his own world to see the humanity around him. He had always seen himself as someone who was too busy to care, someone who couldn't afford to waste time on the small details of other people's lives. But now, standing there in the bustling terminal, he felt a deep sense of regret for all the moments he had missed, for the countless times he had chosen to look away instead of reaching out, instead of acknowledging the simple, shared struggles of being human. He watched as a group of soldiers walked past, their uniforms catching his eye. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all young, with the kind of lean, hardened look that comes from living a life of discipline and sacrifice. They moved with a sense of purpose. Even in this crowded space, their heads held high. For a moment, he thought of Jasmine, and his heart clenched with a sudden, sharp pain. He realized that he had never truly understood what it meant to serve, what it meant to put your life on the line for people who might never even know your name. He wanted to approach the soldiers, to say something, to express the gratitude he now felt so acutely. But as he stepped forward, he hesitated. What could he say that wouldn't sound hollow or performative? How could he convey the depth of his newfound understanding, the profound shift in his perspective, with just a few words? He took a deep breath and continued to watch them, feeling a mixture of awe and sadness. He wished he had known better before, wished he had seen the world with these new eyes years ago. The soldiers stopped for a moment, adjusting their gear and talking quietly among themselves. One of them noticed the businessman staring and gave him a nod. It was a small, simple gesture, but it held a world of meaning. The businessman nodded back, swallowing hard as he felt a lump form in his throat. It was a moment of silent recognition, a fleeting connection that spoke volumes without a single word. Finally, his suitcase appeared on the baggage carousel, and he grabbed it, the handle cold and solid in his grip. He walked out of the terminal, pulling his suitcase behind him, and felt the warm California sun on his face. The light was bright, almost blinding, but he welcomed it. It felt like a cleansing, a kind of rebirth. He realized that he had been living in darkness for so long, his vision clouded by preconceived notions and prejudices he hadn't even been aware of. Outside, the air was filled with the sounds of honking taxis and the constant chatter of people. He stood on the curb for a moment, watching as families reunited, as friends embraced with joyful laughter. He noticed a young soldier, just off the plane, being hugged tightly by an older woman who was crying openly. The soldier's face was a mix of embarrassment and love, as though he were trying to act tough but couldn't help but melt into the comfort of his mother's arms. It was a raw, beautiful moment, and the businessman found himself smiling despite the tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He realized that he had a choice to make now. He could walk away from this experience, chalk it up as a one-time event, a brief moment of clarity that would fade as he returned to his regular life. Or he could choose to change, to carry this lesson with him, to let it shape him into a better person. He knew which choice Tom Sullivan, the man mentioned in Jasmine's note, would have wanted him to make. He thought about Tom's sacrifice, about the kind of man who would give his life for someone else without hesitation. The businessman felt a surge of determination, a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He owed it to Tom and to Jasmine to be better. He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he scrolled down to his assistant's number. He had a meeting scheduled for later that day, an important business deal that had been in the works for weeks. It was the kind of meeting he never canceled, the kind that would normally take precedence over everything else. But today was different. He hit the call button and brought the phone to his ear. "Hey, it's me," he said when his assistant picked up. "Listen, I need you to reschedule my afternoon meetings. Push everything to tomorrow. I need some time today." His assistant was surprised, he could tell. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly. "This meeting is really important. The client is expecting you." "I'm sure," he replied, his voice firmer than it had been in a long time. "Just let them know something came up. I'll take care of it tomorrow." He ended the call and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, he had made a decision based on something other than business, something other than his usual need for control and success. He felt a strange lightness, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked over to a bench near the terminal and sat down, taking out the note once more. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it out on his knee, and read it again. The words were the same, but they felt even more powerful now. He could almost hear Jasmine's voice as he read, calm and steady, filled with a kind of quiet strength that he realized he admired deeply. He thought about what she had written, about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing the humanity in every person he met. It was such a simple idea, yet it had never occurred to him before today. He had spent so much of his life looking at people without really seeing them, judging them based on his own limited perspective. He pulled out his wallet and carefully placed the note inside, next to a faded picture of his own father, who had passed away years ago. His father had been a stern, hard-working man, someone who believed in the value of respect and kindness, even if he hadn't always shown it. The businessman wondered what his father would say if he could see him now, if he would be proud of the change he was trying to make. He hoped he would be. He stood up and made his way back into the terminal. He had made a decision. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He was going to find a way to honor the message in that note, to do something that would make a real difference. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but he knew it would start with a simple act of gratitude, with the words he should have said on that plane, but hadn't found the courage to speak. He walked back to the gate where he had disembarked and looked around until he spotted a group of flight attendants taking a break, chatting quietly among themselves. He approached them slowly, feeling a nervous flutter in his stomach. "Excuse me," he said, his voice unsteady. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you do and for how you treated that soldier on the flight. It meant a lot." The attendants looked at him, surprised, but then one of them, the young woman who had served Jasmine, smiled warmly. "Thank you," she said. "We just try to do our best." The businessman nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm going to try to do better too." He turned and walked away, feeling the warmth of their smiles behind him. As he stepped out into the bright sunshine, he knew he had taken the first step on a new path, one that he hoped would lead him to become the kind of person Tom Sullivan and Jasmine Davis had fought for. A person who saw the world clearly, with open eyes and an open heart.